Hey everyone, and welcome to another video here at Whiteboard Doctor. Thanks for joining us today. Quick disclaimer before we move on. None of these videos are intended to be acted upon as medical advice. Please pause the video here and read the disclaimer in its entirety before moving on. Channel plug. Here at Whiteboard Doctor, our mission is to bring you interesting, relevant, and understandable medical education for all types of lifelong learners, trainees, and practitioners. If you want to follow along, we do have a lovely subscribe button in the bottom right-hand corner of all the videos. Don't forget to hit that like button. And lastly, if you'd like to support us outside of viewing our videos, we have several ways in which you can do that, linked in the video description and pinned comment. Stay well, keep learning, and back to the video. Hello everybody, happy Friday. For those of you that work on the weekends like I do sometimes, Friday still holds a warm spot in our hearts, but maybe not as warm as those who do not work on weekends, in which case this is a extra happy Friday coming into the weekend. We hope this video finds you well. We're excited to be back. Today we're going to talk about a topic that is probably a week or two out of its kind of hot phase, but is a tremendously important topic, something to understand, something that is happening right now around the world, specifically in the United States and even England as well. And that is this idea that polio is back. Polio probably sounds familiar to many of you all, although other than some of our older, with years comes wisdom, this isn't an insult, older Whiteboard Doctor community members, is probably not something that is as rooted in our brains. Polio, though, is a virus, and it's a virus that can actually cause paralysis and death, and it took the news by storm once again. A couple weeks ago, you can see this is just a Google search that brought all this up, and the press was about how polio is back. There's polio cases in the USA, polio cases in England, in Israel. What does this mean? What do experts say? Is this the tip of the iceberg? Hundreds of others could be infected, etc., etc. In the age of COVID, we're still battling COVID, but even kind of post-COVID surges, there's a lot of news attention on transmissible infectious diseases, and this is no different, and that's why I think it's important for us to talk about it, understand it, and really understand what's going on here. So what we're going to talk about in this video is we're going to talk about a quick history of polio. We're going to talk about what polio is, what disease it causes, what signs and symptoms there are, the different vaccinations, and exactly what we need to know about this idea that polio is back or that there's an outbreak or what have you. And a little hint, a glimpse into the future of this video. It's not what you'd think. So definitely stick around, and I think you'll have a better grasp on what all this discussion is about by the end. Feel free to skip around if you'd like to, but we're kind of going to take you from A to Z here in the video. With no further ado, let's dive in. So, quick history of polio. These two images are from this website, the polioeradication.org. It's their material. It's linked in the video description if interested. But polio actually dates back thousands of years. Interestingly enough, there's this Egyptian artifact that shows this Egyptian priest with a withered leg. You can see it here, right? Their right leg is much skinnier than their left leg, and that's sometimes a sign of polio. That's muscle atrophy, which means the muscle breaks down because of the paralysis in that leg doesn't allow the muscle to contract at all. So you get this withered leg from muscle atrophy, and that was from 1580 BC. So polio as a disease has been around for many, 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 many decades, hundreds, thousands of years. But in our present day minds, the thing that is most pressing is this first half of the 20th century where thousands were paralyzed and died. This is a picture of an iron lung machines. That might sound familiar, and they're quite literally machines that you lay in, and they create a pressure difference that helps you expand your lungs, because as this paralysis set in, what would happen is the diaphragms would become paralyzed. So you have your trachea, which is your windpipe, your breathing tube. It branches out into a bunch of smaller airways, and then around that is your lungs, right? These are two lungs. What causes our lungs to breathe, though, are two muscular diaphragms that sit below the lungs, right? Because they're kind of, the lungs are trapped in this thoracic cavity. And the diaphragms contract and relax. And they do that in unison. And when that happens, it causes the lungs to actually see a negative pressure and inflate, or see a positive pressure and deflate. When these diaphragms, these muscles get paralyzed, they can't cause that pressure difference and the lungs won't breathe. And these iron lung machines would take the place of the diaphragms to allow these patients to breathe. Many of these people died. All right, so it's been around for a long time. Some pertinent history about vaccination, because that's going to be a lot of what we're kind of talking about here and how this plays into the current ideas that there's outbreaks of polio. So the first vaccine was developed by Dr. Salk in 1955, and a really important note here is that this was an inactivated and injected vaccine, so this was dead. We're going to use the term dead, although there's lots of debate whether viruses are alive or not, but dead virus, and it had to be injected into the patient. Following that, there was a second vaccine produced in 1961 by Dr. Sabin, and this was a live, weakened virus, but it was alive, in quotes, able to replicate, and it was given orally. And this live, weakened oral vaccine actually became the global standard for a few reasons that we'll get into. Okay? In 1979, polio was actually considered eradicated from the USA because of just this crazy vaccine effort. Everybody was getting vaccinated just because all this was in the public's mind. A disease that affects children, causes paralysis and death. So vaccine efforts in the United States went kind of, I guess the term we'd use now would be viral, and everyone was getting vaccinated. By 1975, it was considered eradicated. Polio was no longer spreading within the United States. Currently, present day, poliovirus is actually only still spreading in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the only two countries, and the cases are minimal. And within this poliovirus, there's actually 3 strains. Wild, no, actually doesn't start with wild. I'm going to cheat and scroll down here to get you the right verbiage. All right. So it's actually WPV. So I was right. See, I still got it. It's been a little while, but there's wild poliovirus type 1, wild poliovirus type 2, and wild poliovirus type 3. And wild poliovirus type 3 has been wiped off the face of the earth. Wild poliovirus type 2 has been wiped off the face of the earth. And wild poliovirus type 1 is the one still spreading, but only in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So 2/3 of the wild strains have been eradicated from the globe. But that begs the question then, but wait. We say, but wait. There are still outbreaks. We're talking about New York, London. There's outbreaks in Asia and Africa every single year. How is that possible if it's only spreading in Afghanistan and Pakistan? Well, the outbreaks that we're talking about are actually not wild type poliovirus, right? It's not that wild type poliovirus, type 3. What these outbreaks are actually that live oral virus that Dr. Sabin produced up here that has mutated and then started to spread in a population. So it's actually vaccine-derived poliovirus is the notation sometimes used, VDPV, vaccine-derived poliovirus. So this wild-type poliovirus, the true poliovirus that has been circulating for centuries, is only present in Afghanistan and Pakistan. But we get these outbreaks that are often small outbreaks of the vaccine-derived poliovirus, this Dr. Sabin's live oral virus vaccine that mutates and then spreads in a population. Now, we are talking a lot about this now, but keep in mind that this is actually has been happening in Asia and Africa. Frequently is not the right word, but much more frequent. There's all this press on it now because it's happening in the United States and in England and in Israel and some of these other, quote unquote, developed countries. But there's been small outbreaks of the vaccine-derived poliovirus in Asia and Africa on a semi-frequent basis, frequent being a relative statement. So keep that in mind as we go forward. Now, one might then ask, I know I did, why in the world would countries be giving this live weakened oral vaccine if it can mutate and cause a disease like polio? Like, why in the world would you do that if there's this inactivated injected vaccine? Well, a few reasons. The first is actually that the live weakened oral vaccine is much better. It doesn't just prevent central CNS, central nervous system disease, but it actually decreases viral replication, decreases transmission, and it does this primarily because it's live weakened, so it activates a more robust immune response, but also because it's given orally. And when we give something orally, I don't know if I can draw an intestine, but we'll just do a zoomed in one. This is going to be the intestine. Within the intestine itself, there's actually these kind of stacks of immune cells. They're often called Pire patches. So when you get an oral vaccine, we'll say this is the weakened polio vaccine, and this is, again, this is the gut, the intestine. These Pire patch areas take this in, and they produce a specific mucosal immune response that typically has IgA antibodies or immunoglobulins. And these IgA antibodies and immunoglobulins can prevent kind of replication in the gut of the polio vaccine and thus decrease viral shedding, decrease transmission, decrease viral replication, all those things. Whereas an inactivated injected vaccine, that polio vaccine really just protects against the worst part of polio, which we're going to get into, which is this poliomyelitis, or the central nervous system paralysis portion. But you can still get the poliovirus with an activated injected vaccine. You just won't get, quote, very sick from it, being this poliomyelitis. So that is one of the reasons that in countries where there's a lower vaccination rate, call it underdeveloped countries, which is the term that some articles use, but really they're just countries that have... Who do you want to call? Oh, I think Siri just picked me up. I don't think I want to call anyone, Siri. Thank you, though. In these countries that have a lower vaccination rate, they have a lot of rationale to try to have decreased viral transmission as part of their vaccination, process. And in addition to that, having an injected vaccine does somewhat limit, some people might not take it because it's injected. It's harder to transport supplies to do the injecting of it. So an oral vaccine is also easier to administer to large populations of people. Where exactly is each different vaccine used? So this is an article, it's actually from 2017, we'll link it in the video description, titled Considerations for Global Withdrawal of the Oral Polio Vaccine After the Eradication of Polio. Here's the journal, here's the DOI number. And what you can see here is dark blue is not using the oral polio vaccine. Light blue is using the oral polio vaccine. And the dark blue countries typically are using the injected vaccine, right? That we'll scroll up for a second. That first one we talked about, that Dr. Salk vaccine, which is the inactivated injected. So these dark blue countries, the United States, Canada, a lot of Western Europe, Australia, are using the inactivated vaccine. But a majority of countries are actually using the oral polio vaccine, right? You can see South America, Africa, Asia, Russia up here. A lot of the South Pacific as well. And the reasons being for what we discussed above. So we just want to give you a glimpse into kind of what countries are using what, but North America, other than Mexico, has been using the injected and activated vaccine, but a majority of the world is using the oral polio vaccine. And that's why we, and by we, I'm a citizen of the United States, so I guess I don't often see news headlines about vaccine-derived polio cases in the United States or North America, but in Asia or in Africa, this is something much more common to them because they are using the oral polio vaccine. So just quickly, let's understand the virology. What is the poliovirus and what is the feared disease? Symptoms, transmission, all that. So poliovirus, drawn here very poorly, is a positive stranded virus. It does not have an envelope. An envelope is kind of this protective coating on the outside of the virus. It does not have an envelope, so it's not protected in that way. Interestingly, though, it is a virus that mutates very quickly. HIV, or human immunodeficiency virus, is a retrovirus that mutates extremely fast, but poliovirus actually has a faster mutation rate in many studies than even HIV. And we talked about this briefly. There were typically, or I should say traditionally, three different strains of poliovirus, but two of them have been eradicated from the world. Wild poliovirus 2 was eradicated in 2015, wild poliovirus 3 was eradicated in 2019 through vaccination efforts. So the only current circulating wild poliovirus is type 1, which again is only found in two countries, being Afghanistan and Pakistan. So why are we talking about poliovirus? What disease does it cause? Well, first, it's transmitted actually fecal-oral, and that phrase means, hand to mouth. You touch something that's contaminated with poliovirus from feces, someone didn't wash their hands, this, that, the other thing, and then you get that in your mouth. That is how it is transmitted. But it is actually very good at transmitting. It's very contagious. It lives out kind in the world in unvaccinated populations or populations that has the inactivated vaccine, and then it finds these pockets of unvaccinated people to cause disease. It replicates in our GI, gastrointestinal tracts, which is why we'll scroll up. This oral vaccine is so popular because it causes this gastrointestinal tract immune response that isn't caused by the injected inactivated vaccine. So it replicates in our GI tract. It most commonly affects kids. Quoted is often kids less than 5 years old, which is obviously very sad. It does cause a viral-like illness at first, so fevers, F for fevers, fatigue, nausea, vomiting, NV, nausea, vomiting, and then you might start to get this neck stiffness, and that can be an ominous sign because the feared complication is when when this virus invades the central nervous system, and it can lead to paralysis, and once paralysis sets in, up to 10% of individuals die. And that's why we saw those pictures above of that leg that had a lot of atrophy and the iron lung. Just quick terminology, because I think it's helpful when understanding a disease what the words mean. So poliomyelitis. Polio is obviously the virus. Myel is actually from the word myelin, and myelin is the sheath that covers nerve cells. So this is a nerve that's running through the body. It has this layer of myelin that insulates it, and it causes that nerve signal to be able to move down the nerve. Myelitis, itis is inflammation of the myelin. So this myelin gets damaged, and then the nerves can't transmit signals, and thus you can't use your muscles, and you get paralyzed. So poliomyelitis, inflammation of the myelin sheath caused by polio. I thought it was kind of cool. Let me know. So the whole point of this discussion is, what are we talking about now? Right, so we've learned about the history, we've learned about the vaccinations and how they differ and the pros and cons and outbreaks and this, that, and the other thing, but why has this taken the media by storm? Well, it all started with this. Lots of text here, but we're going to highlight the important things. So this is from the Centers of Disease Control, and we'll link it in the video description, but they found actually a case of paralytic poliomyelitis. Remember, itis, inflammation of the myelin sheath around nerves caused by polio, in an unvaccinated person. And that was back in July, right? So we highlighted some things. So July 18th, detection of poliovirus type 2 in stool specimens from an unvaccinated immunocompetent, means they have a normal immune system, young adult from Rockland County, New York. They were experiencing acute flaccid weakness. Acute means, quick onset. Flaccid means your muscles don't work at all. And then weakness, you know what that means. They originally came in with fevers, neck stiffness, GI symptoms, and limb weakness. If we scroll up to the polio symptoms, fevers, nausea, vomiting, GI symptoms, fatigue, neck stiffness. So those are the classical symptoms of poliomyelitis. Now, with that being said, those symptoms can be classic of other infections of the central nervous system too. I know if I saw this person in the emergency department, I wouldn't have thought they had polio. That's just such a rare thing. They were hospitalized because of their disease, acute flaccid myelitis, and then they detected vaccine-derived poliovirus type 2, VDPV2, vaccine-derived poliovirus type 2, in the stool specimens of this person on day 11 and 12 after symptom onset. They found that it was the Sabin-like type 2 poliovirus. Sabin-like. Remember, Dr. Sabin was the one who invented the oral vaccine we talked about up above. So then the CDC went to the wastewater in Rockland County, and they actually found there were stool samples collected for COVID testing in the wastewater. They found evidence of the same vaccine-derived poliovirus type 2 24 days before and up to 41 days after the patient's symptoms. So essentially what they're saying is, wait, we have one person who's been affected by this, but we're finding it in the wastewater, the vaccine-derived poliovirus too. And that was the really concerning thing to people. The last wild poliovirus infection occurred in 1979. Remember, this is wild compared to vaccine-derived. And it's the second identification of poliovirus since this time. In 2005 in the United States, there was a type 1 vaccine-derived poliovirus case identified. So that was, 17, 18 years ago. So this is what sparked all of this attention and concern, was this, young individual who's unvaccinated from polio who got vaccine-derived poliovirus and actually got poliomyelitis from it. Now, since this time, the United Kingdom, in London specifically, started testing the wastewater. And in the wastewater, they found a bunch of evidence of a similarly related vaccine-derived poliovirus type 2 in their wastewater. But as far as I could tell, there weren't any actual cases of poliomyelitis detected. And then in Israel, there was a four-year-old child who got poliomyelitis vaccine-derived as well, who was also unvaccinated. So when they say outbreaks, there's a lot of verbiage out there that's saying outbreaks, outbreaks, outbreaks. They are not saying outbreaks of poliomyelitis, right? Because there's only been one case in the United States, none in London, as far as I can tell. Please correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But only one case in the United States of poliomyelitis, the disease. But they found a bunch of vaccine-derived polio in the wastewater. So people are carrying it around and shedding it and passing it in their stool. It's just not anyone is actually getting the poliomyelitis. So why might this be? Well, it all comes back to those vaccines, right? So if we scroll up, let's remember what we talked about here. In the United States, we get the inactivated injected polio vaccine. So it's not a live virus, it's injected so we don't get it orally. And that protects against central nervous system disease. It protects against poliomyelitis. But it does not lead to immunity in our gut, and thus you can still shed and replicate the virus. You just aren't going to get sick from it. So it makes sense that if there's a, quote, outbreak, you're seeing it in the wastewater, even though there's even though there's only one case of poliomyelitis disease. So those individuals vaccinated seem to be protected from getting actually sick from this quote-unquote outbreak. The real people to be worried about are those who are unvaccinated, because this is suggesting there's a degree of spread of vaccine-derived poliovirus in the community, hence why we're saw it in the wastewater. But the population is so well vaccinated that people aren't getting poliomyelitis from that. They're just having it replicate in the gut and they're pooping it out and it's found in the wastewater. But if this were to get into an unvaccinated population, it could cause poliomyelitis and severe disease. So those who are unvaccinated need to really pay attention to this and look out for any of those symptoms: fevers, neck stiffness, nausea, vomiting, weakness, those types of things. Interestingly, just the last little tidbit here, there was discussion in a few articles about this new vaccine potential, which essentially is a live weakened virus, but weakened in a way where they can't supposedly can't mutate and cause CNS disease, central nervous system disease, which would be kind of the best of both worlds. You would have that robust gut immunity, would decrease transmission, viral shedding, but even if it mutated, it wouldn't be able to cause poliomyelitis, the central nervous system disease. So just something to keep in mind there. We hope this was helpful. We hope it made sense. We hope it hopefully abated a lot of the big news headlines about outbreaks and things, and hopefully educated as well those who are both vaccinated and unvaccinated against polio. Let us know what thoughts, comments, questions you have down below. We're excited to be back again. Happy Friday to y'all. And we will see you probably most likely on Friday next week. I'm not sure if we'll have time to get a Monday video out, but we will try. Nonetheless, at the very least, we'll see you Friday next week. In the meantime, stay well, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.